Okay, so we'll just start with our session. Good morning and a warm welcome to all of you. So the first talk will be Dr. Sandhya R on RNFL analysis. I request Mr. Shashank to continue with the the recorded presentation of her.
Sure, ma'am, sure.
Good morning, everybody. I would like to personally thank the COSCON organizers, the President, Dr. Vayal Rajshekhar, Scientific Committee Convener, Dr. Ilan Kumar, for providing me this opportunity. Today, I'm going to speak on RNFL analysis in glaucoma. As we all know, glaucoma is a progressive disease which can lead to blindness. Early detection is crucial. Loss of 25 to 30% of ganglion cell loss happens before it can be detected on field test. Thinning of the RNFL is what we have to detect early, and to document this progression both structurally and functionally is necessary. Imaging occupies a unique place in the treatment of glaucoma because it's the only objective way of quantitatively assessing the damage. Also helps to reassure the patient by showing him or her concrete evidence on paper and having their confidence in terms of change of modality and aggressive form of therapy that we intend to do. There are different modalities to image RNFL, including the OCT, the HRT, and the SLP. The objective nature of imaging, as against the psychophysical nature of visual field testing, as well as the redundancy of the nerve fiber layer defect, helps it score over the standard white-on-white perimetry test in the early stages of the disease. OCT has withstood the test of time and has emerged as a tool of choice for the same. The foundation of the current OCT was laid early in 1900s by Albert Abraham Michelson and was later pioneered by Dr. David Hong. We have several devices for imaging. The HRT, which uses an arbitrary reference plane in relation to which the thickness of the optic nerve rim and the related data are calculated. However, it can measure only optic nerve head parameters. The SLP measures the change in polarization of the transmitted light and correlates it to the neural element of the RNFL. The OCT, on the other hand, actually measures the thickness of the RNFL. The advantages are several: non-invasive, non-contact transpupillary scan of high resolution, cross-sectional, quantitative, and analogous to our P-scan. It has had humble beginnings and over the 14 years gradually developed from being a time domain machine to that which is a spectral domain and a swept source. We've overcome several disadvantages of OCT in terms of resolution, in terms of the signal strength acquisition, the quicker images, quicker processing. All that has been happening well, and we've ended up with a swept source OCT currently. The principle of OCT is that of an interferometer, basic interferometer. The time domain OCT was the initial one which had the interferometry principle. The spectral domain, however, had a spectrometer principle, and the swept source OCT used a light of longer wavelength, which allows imaging of deeper structures as deep as lamina cribrosa as well as the choroidal vasculature. The axial resolution, however, is the same both in spectral domain as well as the swept source OCT. This is how the imaging would appear. Now, coming to the interpretation of the OCT, this is how it appears in a spectralis machine, and this is how it would appear in a Cirrus machine, which is more commonly used. Good to remember that we have the entries of name, the patient ID, the date of birth, and gender. All of these are important. One, because it compares to the database which is there in the machine, as well as for the recall when we are doing the patient, when we are rescanning the patient over a period of time, we could directly get a progression analysis and look at the repetitive scans as well. Now, first and importantly, you have to look at the signal strength. Then you have a key parameter table. You have what we term as the RNFL thickness map, then a neuroretinal rim thickness graph, the RNFL deviation map, an RNFL Tisnet graph, RNFL quadrant-wise and clock-hour-wise thickness graph, as well as the B-scan image, which is both longitudinal as well as transverse. So let's go through these individually. The RNFL analysis is done by using a 3.4 millimeter measurement circle, which is centered on the optic disc using radial scans. Mean RNFL measurement is taken. A Tisnet graph symmetry, sectoral chart, clock-hour chart is taken. The best parameters are that of inferior RNFL and an average RNFL. The quality of scans ranges from 0 to 10. Anything above 6 is acceptable. You have the disc area, which is always in gray. However, when the disc area is less than 1.3 and more than 2.5, the rim area, CD ratio, and CD volume will be shown in gray. The normative database includes an age range of 18 to 84 years with a refractive error ranging from -12 to +8 diopters. Good to remember that green indicates normalcy, yellow indicates borderline values, red indicates disease, white is hypernormal, and gray is not applicable. The artifacts in imaging include patient-dependent ones like media opacities and pupil diameter. Operator-dependent ones are centration and signal strength. Device-dependent ones would include acquisition and database-related ones. The artifacts, as in here, this map showing a loss of data superiorly. Therefore, you have something of a red map here in the deviation map. I have a floor effect here. The RNFL thickness map is completely out of bounds because this is within the calculation circle as well. Whereas when you look at this left eye, you have the loss of data which is happening outside the calculation circle, not affecting the map much here. Here is a shadow defect, probably a PVD or a media opacity. And here is a tilted disc along with the peripapillary atrophy. So what you're seeing are falsely marked inferior RNFL thinnings. The average thickness will improve with repeated scans, especially when you have decentered ones. Here you have a superiorly decentered measurement. And here it increased superior NRR thickness, whereas the RNFL thinning over a repeat scan much improves. The RNFL thickness map is what you see coded from blue to white. Blue is thin and white is thickest. Normally has an hourglass pattern with red and yellow in the superior and the inferior quadrants, which are thicker as compared to nasal and temporal. And there's a color scale right on the left side with microns being indicated. The deviation map compares the clusters of pixels in the test image with the normative database and then color codes them accordingly. So small localized defects, which would probably be lost and would not be visible in any other graph, could be picked up with the RNFL deviation maps. So this is how a healthy RNFL would look. Hourglass pattern, normal on deviation map, suspect, thinning superiorly, flagged off in the deviation map, moderate glaucoma, thinning superiorly, inferiorly, flagged off in the deviation map, severe glaucoma, all blue, and the thinning completely pixelated in the superior and inferior RNFL deviation maps. The NRR thickness will detect any focal changes, compare it to the normative database. Inferior quadrant is what you should be looking at because it's the least resistant to age-related decay. The TISNET graph has this, the double hem pattern here. So anywhere that you don't see the double hem pattern or you see a focal dip in the graph like is seen in this inferior quadrant should raise eyebrows. The RNFL quadrant and clock hour maps will give you the thickness in the superior, inferior, nasal, and temporal quadrants respectively. It could flag it off as being borderline as in this case. However, early focal changes could be picked up in the clock hour maps and would probably get averaged out in your quadrant maps. Commonly affected clock hours are 7 in the right and 5 in the left eye. These are the normal parameters and their ranges for clock hour and quadrant weight maps. It's not sufficient, it's not necessary that you would know any of these values because the machine flags off the abnormalities according to the color coding. The B-scan imaging longitudinal and transverse are visible. The ILM and cup boundaries are shown in red. The RP and disc boundaries are shown in black. Make sure that it is properly placed, aligned, and there is no segmentation error that happens. If it touches the upper margin, it can cause the image to fold over. So then you'll need a repeat scan. Let's come to the red disease, which is nothing but the thinner RNFL of the high myope doesn't conform to the limits identified by the normative database. And therefore, the entire machine flags it off as a red disease. Green disease occurs in patients who have normal global values, have a focal loss. So the machine flags them off as normal and you would pick them up only the focal changes in certain graphs. For example, you probably can pick them up in the TISNET graphs. Progression analysis is an additional feature that is available. It has both trend and event-based analysis. So you have the thickness, the deviation maps, and the RNFL thickness and TISNET graphs. And you have a possible loss, a likely loss, and a possible progression, which are color-coded and then can be read off directly. Let's just interpret this one OCT report. You have a signal strength of 7. You have slight thinning of the RNFL superiorly on the thickness map, picked up on the deviation map, thinning superiorly, inferiorly, picked up on the thickness deviation maps, see them in the parameter table as well. You see the RNFL thickness graph showing a dip here and a dip in the inferior quadrant comes up as the quadrant in the quadrant map as well as in the clock hour map. So we are possibly looking at an early glaucoma in the right eye and looking at what we term as the moderate or severe glaucoma in the left. Thank you.
I thank Dr. Sandhya for a good lucid presentation on RNFL analysis, which is a very vast topic and very comprehensive and important for the diagnosis of glaucoma as well. So let's move on to our next talk for today. So that will be by my mentor, Dr. Satyan Parthasarathy from Coimbatore. He's a very well-known person for all glaucoma faculty here. And I request him to talk on how does refractive surgery affect glaucoma management. Thank you, sir. Over to you, sir. I request Mr. Shashank to carry on with the Dr. Satyan's talk, please. I will.
Hello.
Yeah, sir has joined. So
His name, please?
Dr. Satyan.
Satyan P, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
No, the next will be mine because sir has just joined. So we would finish off his talk first.
Yeah, actually, here was it was yours, ma'am. But you told no.
I will take next.
Thanks to KOS and Dr. Ilan Kumaran for the invitation. I am Dr. Satyan, going to talk on target intraocular pressure. What is really you mean by target intraocular pressure? It is the upper limit of intraocular pressure that prevents further damage in the glaucomatous process as per the American Academy of Ophthalmology. Why do we really have to establish the target intraocular pressure? We all know that we have to maintain the functional vision throughout the patient's lifetime, with a minimal effect on the quality of life. Looking at the normal visual decay versus the glaucomatous progression, normal visual decay above the age of 40 years, if you really look at it, is about 0.06 decibels per year. In untreated glaucoma, probably it goes beyond 1.1 decibel per year. That means the patient is going to lose the vision very quickly. In a clinical treated glaucoma, you can expect somewhere around 0.4 to 0.6 decibels per year, the change or the mean rate of progression. If you just look at this, the rate of visual field progression, it can really vary. You see here the dotted line is in A, that is a normal individual. Then you look at B and C, where there is a functional loss which has been written there. The B is a person who is old enough or old age patient, and C is the younger one. But both of them, they have the same amount of progression, same moderate progression. But the younger one will lose a significant amount of visual field loss because he has a long life expectancy in comparison to the person who is in the B. Looking at the E, where the patient has a faster progression, and you can see the functional loss occurs much earlier in comparison to the person who is D, where the progression rate is pretty slow. So every millimeter of mercury reduction in glaucoma really matters. So what does the studies give us an indication or give us information about this? All the major clinical trials, starting from EMGT, ocular hypertension treatment study, and EGPS, continued glaucoma study, all of the studies have shown that there is a risk reduction of between 10 to 19% or 20% per millimeter of IOP drop. So it's important. The target intraocular pressure has to be individualized. It is not a very general terminology we can use for every patient, depending upon the risk profiles involved. Because IOP is a dynamic process, it can be highly variable patient to patient. There are the normal variations, and because of the lack of patient compliance with the treatment, therapy can have fluctuations even up to like 11 millimeters of mercury or 12 millimeters of mercury. And you just take the circadian intraocular pressure also, it can show you pretty high fluctuations. Just looking at this chart, you can see if the patient has a circadian range of more than 11.8 millimeters of mercury, you can see there is a significant change in the visual field progression in comparison to those patients who have less than 7.7 millimeters of mercury IOP change. So there are many factors needs to be considered when you are setting the target intraocular pressure, starting from the baseline or the presenting intraocular pressure, circadian IOP, the fellow eye, the the population mean standard deviation of intraocular pressures, corneal thickness, severity of the disease, rate and extent of the progression, patient age, family history, race, systemic illness, cost and risk of treatment. There are many factors needs to be thought of. So what does this glaucoma clinical trials gives us the information about this? Starting from the WARDS trial, it shows that when you have the IOP drop of 20% or the CNTGS shows about 30%, there is a significant percentage of the patients will not progress. But there is a certain amount of patients, in spite of this IOP lowering, still they do progress. Just let us come to the collaborative initial glaucoma treatment, medication versus surgery, where the IOP has been reduced from 38 to 46%, and they have seen that there is almost no progression in these patients. Also, let us look at this AGIS data, that is advanced glaucoma intervention study shows that, see from this chart, the group A here shows that almost there is no progression. So what is this? There is no progression means. At every given point in time, the mean IOP is maintained at 12.3 millimeters of mercury. These patients have not shown that any visual field progression over a period of 96 months in comparison to the group B, C, and D, where they have shown a significant amount of progression with variabilities. So setting the target pressure, we need to understand, this chart gives us a lot of information. How is the damage of the disease? Is it early damage, advanced damage, life expectancy? How much is the untreated IOP? That means we have to include the corneal thickness in this. The additional risk factors involved, the rate of progression, everything needs to be considered before we set the target intraocular pressure for these patients. But there are three main factors needs to be accounted. One is the amount of glaucomatous damage, what is the life expectancy of these patients, and what is the untreated intraocular pressure. This is going to be the essence of that. So let us look at how we can set the target intraocular pressure in a clinical practice. As we said earlier, the percentage and absolute amount of pressure reduction and a predetermined intraocular pressure range has to be considered. That means both the things has to be considered for when you're looking at the target intraocular pressure. So as per the preferred practice pattern, if you can reduce intraocular pressure by 25% or more, we have clearly understood this is going to really reduce the progression of the disease. So you can see here, the stage of the damage and the intraocular pressure are the most relevant drivers for the target intraocular pressure. When the patient has very early damage and a very short life expectancy, and IOP is high, there is no additional risk factors, probably you can set the pressures at a higher teens. But when the patient has advanced damage with the untreated IOP is still lower and long life expectancy, you need to set the target pressures at a much lower levels, like low teens or single digits, depending upon the stage of the disease. So looking at this, what is the very practical guidelines one can have on primary open-angle glaucoma and NTG is, when the patient has early glaucoma, probably you can look at somewhere around 18 or lesser, moderate glaucoma 15 and less, advanced glaucoma 12 and less, and in terminal glaucoma, probably we have to look at less than 10 millimeters of mercury. Similarly, in NTG also, we have to look at that early, moderate, and severe, 15, 12, and lesser than 10 millimeters, most likely will be the ideal ones. So when we are trying to set the target pressures, we need to start on treatment. So what could be the possible initial treatment that we'll have to start on? We understand today that prostaglandins probably is one of the most preferred choice of drugs, where it has the highest safety, the systemic and ocular safety. And also we know that it has a good compliance rate because it's once a day application, which gives a 24 hours of IOP reduction in these patients. And so that's the reason why we probably have to stick on to that. So once it has been done and you have started on medication and you see that the progression and other damages happening, so early detection of progression also is critical, so which will prevent any further loss for these patients. So once you do the visual fields in these patients, so what does this early manifest glaucoma treatment and UK glaucoma treatment shows us? When you can reduce intraocular pressure by about 25%, there is only 14% of these treated patients had shown that progression, and also in UK GTS of 20% IOP drop, there is about 15.2% of the other patients had shown the progression in comparison to those untreated group. So resetting the intraocular pressure in the presence of progression has to be thought of. Many factors may be there. So just think about the compliance, circadian rhythm, and need to get the lower intraocular pressures. So once you see the progression, consider reducing the intraocular pressure to much lower levels. So we need to start looking at the second drug. So that could control. And similar process needs to be followed up to see how the progression is. So in conclusion, target intraocular pressure has to be individualized. Setting the target pressure and attempting it to attain it should be a dynamic process. Don't try to adhere to any specific numbers, which is completely going to be wrong. So every time when you get a new piece of information like visual field progression, you should be willing to change the target pressure so that the patient can see well enough throughout his lifetime. That is going to be our goal. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir. Thanks for that beautiful presentation. So, Mr. Shashank, let's move on to my topic next: management of post-op shallow chamber.
Sure, ma'am. Sure.
Yeah, I have just posted on the chat group that if there are any questions, we'll take it up at the end of the session. Is that fine?
Sorry, ma'am. What?
Any questions will be taken at the end of the session from the participants. If they can put it in the chat box, we can take it at the end of the session.
Sure, ma'am.
Okay. Good morning, everybody. A warm good morning to all of the delegates here. I'm Dr. Shilpa. I thank OSCON Organizing Committee and Scientific Committee for giving me an opportunity to speak on management of post-op shallow chamber. So as we all know, post-operative shallow chambers after filtering surgery is a very common and quite a challenging situation to manage. So we have to have a dictum at the end of the surgery to conclude a filtration surgery after ascertaining that the anterior chamber is well formed and with a filtering bleb, well formed bleb. But the appearance can change in next 24 hours. So we need to be ready with the changes that can happen. So how does it present? What are the signs that we have to look for? What are the causes? And the management per se will depend upon the cause. So shallowing of anterior chamber after filtering surgery is a known complication with a rate between 13 to 25%. So that's quite a good number. The chamber is shallowest in first 2 to 3 days after surgery and gradually deepens over next 2 weeks. Prompt yet appropriate management can be of great significance as persistent shallow chamber may lead to certain other complications like formation of peripheral anterior synechiae, failure of filtration. There can be cataract changes, corneal decompensation, posterior synechiae, and hypotonous maculopathy, which is vision threatening problem. So the management should depend upon the identification of cause, as I told you, what is the durations in surgery, and what are the metabolites that were used during surgery, and what is the degree of anterior chamber shallowing that we are dealing with. So, and baseline visual acuity, intraocular pressure, bleb characteristics, and condition of optic nerve and posterior segment finding should be noted. So how does it present? Usually with a decreased vision, the patient has ocular discomfort, pain, irritation, watering, foreign body sensation. So severe pain associated with nausea and vomiting in cases which present with very high IOP can be associated with aqueous misdirection and suprachoroidal hemorrhage too, which has to be kept in mind, though a rare entity. After recording the visual acuity intraocular pressure, we need to grade the anterior chamber depth into 3 grades. Grade 1 is only where there is peripheral iris and cornea position. Grade 2 is cornea to mid iris, and grade 3 is the lenticular part also comes forward. So gonioscopy should be done to confirm the patent surgical iridectomy, and the B-scan may help in locating aqueous misdirection. So postoperative shallow chambers can be with hypotony or with normal also or high IOP. So with hypotony, it can be in the early postoperative period or the late postoperative period. With normal to high IOP, we see it most commonly in aqueous misdirection, which again can happen in early to late postoperative period, and suprachoroidal hemorrhage. So the causes, when we see, it can be due to overfiltration, the bleb leak or the cyclodialysis cleft, decreased aqueous production caused by inflammation, cerebroidal detachment, retinal detachment, or inadvertent use of aqueous suppressants postoperatively also can be the cause. So small leaks with no frank leak with grade 1 to 2 shallow chambers will heal spontaneously, require no further management, whereas leak with frank leak with grade 1 to 2 shallow chamber can be treated with patching, glue with BCL, which will cover the leak area, and the Simon shell. Frank leak with grade 3 shallow chamber may need a revisit to OR for resuturing of the flap and the conjunctiva. When there's an overfiltrating bleb with grade 1 to 2 shallow chambers in early postoperative period usually settles with conservative measures like pressure patch and decreased frequency of steroids so that healing is favored, and cycloplegics. Whereas in grade 2 to 3 shallow chambers, which are not settling down with after a week's time of conservative treatment, then compression sutures can be applied over the bleb area using a 90 nylon suture anchored from limbus to posterior edge of the bleb, which can curtail the overfiltration. Compression sutures can be in the figure of 8 form over the bleb from end to end so that the filtration is restricted and the AC forms eventually. Persistent shallow chamber with hypotony more than a week and choroidal detachment is an indication for choroidal drainage if it is lasting for more than a week, and AC reformation definitely takes time with revision of the filtering site. Shallow chamber with normal or high IOP. Possible mechanisms would be pupillary block with non-perforating peripheral iridectomy. Can be just, we can just do a laser iridectomy and open it up again. Aqueous misdirection of aqueous into vitreous cavity and expansion of suprachoroidal space with blood or effusion are the possible causes. So when we are dealing with, this is the most common entity that we come across in filtering surgery post angle closure glaucomas, or after baseline presentation of very high pressures who have undergone a filtering surgery, they can have an aqueous misdirection. So, it presents with grade 2 to 3 shallow chambers with very high IOP. Maybe sometimes the pressures can be normal, but still a patent peripheral iridectomy should be established, and the cause should be kept in mind. Investigations will include UBM to see for the anterior rotation of ciliary processes with anterior shift of iris lens diaphragm, and B-scan to rule out aqueous pockets. Management will include absolutely no miotics because it's a shallow chamber, vigorous strong cycloplagia with atropine, preferably inflammation control with topical steroids, and IOP lowering medications, both systemic and topical, may be needed as per the case. And intervention depends on the lens status of the eye. If it's a phakic eye, vitreous stab with pars plana with AC reform via pars plana with AC reformation may suffice. If no response, then lensectomy with anterior vitrectomy and thorough conduit between anterior chamber and the vitreous cavity to establish the aqueous pockets opening up into the anterior chamber. And the pseudophakic eye, if it's a pseudophakic eye, NDR capsulotomy and a hyaloidectomy most of the times through the peripheral iridectomy is successful. But in case if it's an aphakic eye, then anterior hyaloidectomy should be done. And surgical intervention may be needed if the after in a pseudophakic eye, the posterior capsulotomy with core vitrectomy and pars plana approach followed by AC reformation as a final measure. Suprachoroidal hemorrhage, most dreaded complication, but unfortunately rare. It happens after glaucoma surgery in elderly hypertensive patients when it is associated with sudden decompression of a high pressure eye. According to 5-fluoride Russell study group, the incidence was 6% in presenting IOP less than 30 and 30 to 39% in presenting IOP. If the presenting IOP is less than 30 to 39, then about 11%. And about 20% of eyes had this if the presenting IOP was between 40 to 49 millimeters of mercury. So this clearly indicates that higher the IOP before surgery, then more the chances of patient going into suprachoroidal hemorrhage post surgery. The risk factors being trauma, aphakia, vitrectomized eye, pathological myopia, congenital myopia, systemic anticoagulants, and even can happen after a trivial procedure like a suture release. Then presentation can be with sudden loss of vision, severe pain, nausea, vomiting, and the diagnosis can be confirmed on B-scan. So management requires supportive treatment with aqueous suppressants and hyperosmotic agents to reduce the pressure with steroids and cycloplegia topically. Definitive treatment is suprachoroidal drainage, preferably which has to be done after clot lysis, which would take about 5 to 7 days with AC reformation. So the prevention is the best form than to just deal with all these post-operative procedures and stress on the patient as well as on the surgeon. So use antimetabolites more judiciously, minimize its use in primary cases and young myopes. Try to minimize the development of high or low intraocular pressure. Try to minimize the development of high or low post-operative IOP for target IOP. Assess filtration intraoperatively after formation of anterior chamber with saline through paracentesis. Protect the conjunctiva from surgical trauma. Avoid excess cauteries. Suture scleral flap appropriately to obtain gentle filtration. And releasable sutures have to be timed. Release of them also have to be timed appropriately depending on the use of antimetabolites. Avoid early suture lysis. So the management of post-op shallow chamber includes careful assessment of patient, appropriate identification of the cause, more conservative measures to start with, and then surgical intervention only when conservative measures fail or there is an urgent situation threatening the vision. Individualized treatment is have to be individualized. There is no protocol-based treatment for this for each patient. So thank you for your patient listening. Any questions I would like to take at the end of the session. So let's move on to the next talk for the day. How does refractive surgery affect glaucoma management by Dr. Rajul Parekh. Mr. Shashank, are you there?
Good morning, everyone. So I'd like to thank the KSOs for inviting me. My talk is the refractive surgery in relation to the glaucoma. So the glaucoma is a chronic progressive optic neuropathy, which has a characteristic typical optic disc changes and RNFL changes with corresponding visual field defect, where intraocular pressure is a major causal risk factor. So typically this kind of patient RNFL defect is more easily seen on the red field photograph in earlier nasal step. So basically the optic disc changes happens for the visual field changes. Of course, my talk is not about this. My talk is in relation to the refractive surgery. Now, when we talk about the refractive surgery, the central corneal thickness is very important. So the normal corneal thickness varies between 520 to 530 micron. We know that the thick cornea, the IOP measurement with Goldmann aberration tonometer is more, but in thin cornea, the IOP measurement is less, and we can miss the open angle glaucoma. We diagnose patient with normal tinted glaucoma, and this is very important when it comes to the refractive surgery. There are multiple nomograms. There is no agreement. Basically, no nomograms is good enough to use in clinical practice to convert the exact IOP measurement, because IOP reduction is non-linear. after the refractive surgery. So what I will try to cover the preoperative consideration, intraoperative consideration, and the postoperative consideration, including the long-term management. So first is that when we are examining the patient for the face, it's very important to ask the patient for the history of glaucoma, family history of glaucoma, because myopia is a risk factor for opening of glaucoma, and the family history and myopia do have relation. So we have to ask, and the patient have a strong family history of glaucoma, especially the glaucoma blindness, then we have to reconsider doing the LASIK or refractive surgery. All patients require complete checkup, but we are limiting the patient from the LASIK work. Please do not forget complete checkup that requires multiple IOP checkup, preferably with good definition or ocular response analyzer or DCT. Gonioscope, of course, in young patient they would be open, but please do gonioscopy. Preoperative optic disc assessment, preferably take the disc photograph because they can help in the long-term follow-up. The long-term when they have reach 40s and 50s. If you can do imaging, the optic disc imaging and GCC, that could act as a baseline. Perimetry is very important. Of course, myop, it's usually high myop. They may have a changes which is related to the myopia. This would act as a baseline. In future, the changes in the perimetry can be evaluated much more easily. And you see this kind of disc, they have a large beta zone peripapillary atrophy. Picking up glaucoma is difficult. So take the disc photograph rather than drawing. The disc photograph remains in your store and can be utilized in the long-term follow-up. The intraoperative IOP. Now, if you are doing the SMILE, then it's different issue, but otherwise, all femtosecond or microcuratum, they elevate the IOP. And I've just given the different machine, that how much IOP can fluctuate during the procedure. So it can elevate from 65 to 216 millimeter mercury. Of course, it's temporary, very short term, but in the eye which is susceptible, this can cause ischemia and optic damage. So we have to keep in mind. So look the disc, optic disc carefully, and you can use this. A proper clinical examination is a screening to whether you want to do the refractive surgery or not. Post-operatively, the steroid response is very important. Of course, the steroid response depends upon the dose of medication, which medication you are giving, how long you are giving, but remember that the myo, if they have family history, then they are more susceptible for the steroid response. So keep that in mind, the steroid response, because it can cause the steroid-induced glaucoma, and you have to monitor, maybe manage differently. So post-operatively, intraoperative measurement is also very important to look for the steroid response. Certain things which can happen, like pressure-induced stomach ectopathy is a rare complication. It can look like DLK, but both are different. Here the steroid is the causative factor. You have to remove the steroid, you may require IOP lowering medications. So the diffuse intralamellar inflammation can cover the whole flap. Though I don't do much of the refractive surgery, but you have to keep this in mind, because this is one of the factor where IOP reduction is important. So you have to check the pressure. The other thing, if you have a loose flap interface cyst, that would measure the low pressure. The patient may have a high pressure, but your application will measure the low pressure. So this has to be kept in mind if the patient has unusually coronary edema. Please have a glaucoma specialist opinion. The other thing, myopia, who corrected myopia, the patient remains the myopic for the rest of the life. So it doesn't require the refractive correction. So basically, the risk factor remains the same even after the correction. So they require the regular monitoring, which is very important. All myop patients, the lifelong, as age increases, the risk of glaucoma increases. And with correction, the pressure may be measured lower with the application. So that thing also has to kept in the mind. Now, the human apprehension has limitation. So if you look at newer tonometers like ocular response analyzer or opacity dynamic control tonometer, they have a little advantage over the cat. So the shown to be less affected by the ablation. So DCT doesn't affect the corneal tissue, making the measurement independent of corneal properties, and ORA measures corneal hysteresis. So these two are maybe a better technology. Of course, we require more data because hysteresis is lots of research going on, but it requires more data that how to use in a day-to-day practice. But they have a potential to use in a day-to-day practice for the longer time. Now, one question comes in: what is the risk of development of glaucoma after the refractive surgery? So the recent data shows that refractive surgery doesn't increase the risk, doesn't increases the risk factor. Of course, you have to remember that it causes a thin cornea. It may measure the IOP lower on ablation torometry. It changes the corneal biomechanics. So IOP measurement error do happens, and that has to be kept in the mind. But alone refractive surgery is not a risk factor for the glaucoma progression or development. So to conclude, IOP is a risk factor. A proper preoperative evaluation is very important. It has to be multiple. The application IOP, ORA or DCT much better. Do the disc assessment, take the disc photograph, imaging, and keep that in the store or give the patient so that can be used by the and give for the long-term monitoring. Provide the preoperative IOP and corneal thickness to the patients. So whoever treats in the future or examine the patient, it can be kept in the mind. What is the preoperative corneal thickness and now what is the post? Of course, we cannot correct directly, but the difference of the corneal thickness can be considered while making the management. And they do require lifelong management plan. So, optic IOP is the only modifiable risk factor treatment of glaucoma, but at this point in time, glaucoma remains relative contraindication for the refractive procedures. We require more recommendation, more investigation that these machines to be used. That ORA DCT has potential to replace Goldmann apprehension tonometer. The newer technology like SMILE may be better than because it doesn't cause the IOP rise. So we require more data and maybe a better technology in future. So at this point I will conclude my presentation saying that if there is any strong history of glaucoma or glaucoma blindness, the refractive surgery should not be advised in a patient with myopia. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, sir. Thank you, Dr. Raju, for that nice presentation. We all have doubts regarding refractive surgery in glaucoma patients, whether initially to start with, whether to do it or not, and then post-op follow-up regarding the pressure measurement, as Dr. Raju pointed out. So with this, let's move on to the next topic for today's session. It's by Dr. Swati R on newer perimetric techniques. Thank you.
A very good morning to all. At the outset, I would like to thank KOS for giving me this opportunity. The topic allotted to me for today is newer perimetry techniques. I'll be covering under the following subheadings. There has been a revolutionary improvement in perimetry technology. In olden times, they were doing manual kinetic testing of the visual fields using tangent screen. The boundaries of the visual field of the patient were mapped manually. Looks like a tedious procedure. On the right side, we can see virtual reality perimetry being performed nowadays. You can notice the patient smile while performing the test, as it is a convenient test. Why do we need newer perimeters? Because the present perimeters are cumbersome. As we all know, the gold standard procedure for perimetry is standard automated perimetry. Humphrey field analyzer is the most commonly used perimeter. Though quite informative, it is difficult to administer as well as to undergo. In fact, when we had joined for glaucoma fellowship, we were asked to undergo the test ourselves just to realize the exact difficulties faced by the patient while doing the test. No wonder VF protocols ranked as the worst in popularity among patients, as found by a study by Gardner et al. To assess the patient's opinions of different clinical tests used in glaucoma management. Hence, we need newer strategies which are more efficient, reliable, at the same time accessible to all, which we could accurately predict which patient is at highest risk of severe vision loss based on field effects. We have a newer testing strategy, CETA Faster. When compared to CETA Standard 24-2, the testing time is cut down by 50%. But we should be cautious to do this test in moderate to advanced glaucoma, as progression may be concealed if we do only CETA Faster in such patients, as found by studies. We also need better testing patterns to understand structure and function relationships in glaucoma. With advancement in structural modalities, the ganglion cell complex loss at macula is known to occur in glaucoma. We need appropriate field testing methods for macular region. All these years, we have been concentrating on the central 30-degree of the visual field for glaucomatous defects. But glaucomatous functional loss may also occur beyond 30-degree. But the current peripheral field tests are time-consuming, hence the need for better tests. Microperimetry, also known as fundus perimetry, has come into clinical practice. It better explains the structure and functional relationship as the data is obtained at the same time with improved alignment and localization. COMPASS microperimeter is the prototype. This is how the report of COMPASS perimetry looks. First is the color image of the optic disc obtained by SLO. Then superimposition of threshold sensitivity pattern values on the optic disc image. Then we have grayscale representation of 24-2, total and pattern deviations. Results plotted on the Bruce-Mee glaucoma staging system. We can also monitor the fixation behavior during the test. There are various other types of perimetry: SWAP, FDT, motion perimetry, high-pass resolution or ring perimetry, random dot motion automated perimetry, also called as rare bit perimetry, flicker-defined form or edge perimetry. Due to time constraint, I will not be going into details of each. Now is the era of portable perimeters. Home perimetry provides additional data to office perimetry. Clinical examination will still be needed as confirmatory testing and treatment decisions, but a faster, easier home perimetry can determine when the patients need to return to the specialist. Home perimeter allows for remote monitoring of patients and teleglaucoma care. Mind you, this can be very useful during the current pandemic time. There are numerous smartphone and iPad-based apps. One of them is Visual Fields Easy app. It is quite rapid, less than 3 minutes for the test per eye, inexpensive as well. It uses supra-threshold strategy. This is how the report of Visual Fields Easy screening app looks in advanced glaucoma compared to HFA and in moderate glaucoma. There are few limitations of the smartphone and tablet-based perimeters. Neither they can control fixation nor the distance from the eye to the screen. Here comes the role of virtual reality headsets, which address these issues through adjustable fixation and gaze tracking. Now there are many perimeters with virtual reality, but Periscreener was the first prototype which did only supra-threshold testing. Now we have virtual eye, head-mounted eye tracking perimeter. This is how it looks. It has equivalent of full threshold 24-2. It has also embedded visual grasp technique, which does objective perimetry, does not require manual input from the patient, so no need of cortical processing and decision making by the patient. We have another virtual reality perimeter known as C3 Field Analyzer. This is an Indian device capable of threshold field testing. Its optical design removes the need for an eye patch or dark room. There are numerous advantages of VR perimeters. These are compact, portable, affordable. The patient can freely move, no restrictions. They can even be moving while doing the test. The VR perimetry can be done in bedridden and wheelchair-bound patients. These perimeters work on rechargeable battery pack, so they don't require external power supply. They don't even require internet to connect wirelessly to operator's smartphone, which displays the real-time stimuli and the report while the test is being done. However, there are few limitations of newer perimeters. Sensitivity is not as good as standard automated perimetry. So we can miss early glaucoma. Gaze tracking by camera is not there in most models. It can be uncomfortable for claustrophobic patients. The normative database is still new, evolving, needs updates. Few words about objective perimeter. One of the method is pupil perimetry, which measures the amplitude or latency of the pupillary response using infrared pupillometry. We can do bilateral simultaneous examination. The machine gives automatic asymmetry reporting. There is another method of objective perimeter known as portable brain-computer interface. In Google, virtual reality perimeter uses multifocal steady-state visual evoked potentials to detect patient response. It is faster and more reliable as it eliminates patient's errors. This is how the machine looks, and this is how the report. Role of artificial intelligence in perimetry. With implementation of AI in perimetry, we can get automation of visual field interpretation. As we acquire more data, algorithms could optimize comparison of patients with similar severity or patient's own baseline with better predictive analytics. What does the future hold for us in perimetry? I'd like to quote Dr. Chris A. Johnson in his article in Innovating Solutions. He says the development, evaluation, and validation of new visual field procedures will require considerable time, multicenter trials, evidence-based decisions, and clinical meaningfulness. These goals must be accompanied using the state-of-the-art technology, yet simple and clear to be effectively pursued in busy clinical setting. That summarizes all requirements for newer perimeters. Thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you, Dr. Swati. Thank you for that very innovative presentation, and got to know a lot of about newer perimeters. So next we will move on to the next talk for the day by Dr. Ankur Sinha, performing a perfect perimetry and avoiding the pitfalls.
Greetings to everyone from Jaipur. At the outset, I would like to thank Dr. Elin and KSOS for giving me the opportunity to be a part of this program. I'll be talking on performing a perfect perimetry and avoiding pitfalls. Now, pitfalls in perimetry could be either in performing the test or in the interpretation of tests. The ophthalmologist who is reading the test should be smarter than the machine and the perimetrist who is doing the test on our behalf. Now let us start with the minimum criteria for glaucomatous damage. The criteria are the GHT outside normal limits, a cluster of 3 non-edge points having a probability or a p-value of being normal, being less than 5%, one of which should have a p-value of less than 1%, a CPSD less than 5%. In the present day of CETA strategies, the CPSD has been replaced by pattern standard deviation or PSD. Now we have a look at this visual field. The GHT here is outside the normal limits. We clearly have a cluster of more than 3 non-edge points having a p-value of less than 5% and at least one of them having a p-value of less than 1%. The PSD is also less than 5%, that is less than 0.5%. So is this glaucomatous? We further move on and we can divide the visual fields into early, moderate, and severe kind of visual fields defects because of glaucoma, depending upon the mean deviation, number of points having a depressed p-value of less than 5% on the pattern deviation plot, and number of points having a p-value of less than 1% in pattern deviation plots. We also take into consideration the points in the central 5 degrees, that whether they are depressed below 15 decibels, and any of the points having a value of 0 decibels in the central 4 points. Now we try and decide whether this is a early, moderate, or a advanced visual field defect. So here the mean deviation is 5 decibels. So probably it's an early visual field defect, but we have around 25 visual points which are less than, having a p-value of less than 5%, and 16 points having a p-value of less than 1%. So probably it's a moderate kind of visual field defect. And there is no problem in the central 4 points, that there's no point having a decibel value of less than 15, and none of them in the central 4 points is having a decibel value of 0. So is this defect glaucomatous actually? And if it is glaucomatous, whether it is mild, moderate, or severe. So we went ahead and find out that this is probably a mild to moderate kind of visual field defect. But when we look at these discs, this doesn't fit into this criteria. The problem here is that this visual field defect is because of drooping of lids. So this is the visual field defect, visual fields of a patient after lid taping, where the visual field defects are gone. So it is always advisable to check for the palpebral opening and pupillary size before we label the visual field defects as actually glaucomatous. We also should take into consideration the patient comfort, as it is a demanding procedure, require attentiveness of the patients, and may need to be repeated. We should make the patients very clear that it is not a test of their artistic, intellectual, or physical ability, which needs to be passed at any cost. And it should be known to the patient that not all points are seen by each and everyone. Take care of the position, as in this case, the chin is kind of set up a little back from the chin rest. So this can cause a little bit of scotoma because of the brow and cause something like a superior visual field defects. The correct position is something like this, where the chin rest is abutting the chin. The position of lens is also important. Here the lens is separated very far from the eye. So this can create something like a ring scotoma when the visual field is being done. This is the correct position of lens placement, which allows almost full visual fields to be seen through the lens. Also check for the position of lens as regard to centration, because this can create some prismatic defects and reflective errors. It is important to understand that test speeds need to be lowered, especially in cases of elderly patients and differently abled patients, because they are not able to press the trigger right in time. It is also to be understood that test speed can be changed even when the test is in progress. Take care of the fixation target. Usually a central yellow light in the center is given as a fixation target, but if the patient is having a macular degeneration, small diamond can be utilized. Large diamond can be utilized in case of large central scotomas, and bottom LED for superior visual field defects. Place the appropriate distance correction with generous near addition as a lens power in the lens holder of the perimeter. We should not be asking patient to use his accommodation, so a copious near addition should be given, and all the cylinders more than one diopter should be placed in the proper axis. Now we move on to common artifacts and errors. This is a rim artifact because of improper lens placement, as we just discussed, where the lens is placed very much away from the eye. Now this is the case of patient who presented to us in 2007 with increasing visual field defects in the right eye for a filter surgery. So we can see from March 2001 to January 2007, the visual field defects have advanced in terms of mean deviation, pattern standard deviation, and the GST, which has gone from borderline to outside normal limits. But when we repeat the visual fields, the mean deviation drops from what it was in 2007 to what it is in 2011. Similar, the PSD is nearly same, or it is slightly better off. The reason here was this right eye visual field was done on the left eye program, and this right was cut, and the left was cut and made right here. So in this case, what happened was the software identified the blind spot of patient as pathological scotoma, and the software's blind spot was seen by the patient. An increase in the mean deviation was because of increase in the media opacity. This is the same patient, the other eye, which is pretty well controlled, and on the medications, no surgery was done for this patient. Now there can be problem of high false positive and fixation losses, which is known as white scotoma. This is usually seen in trigger happy patients because the patient keeps on pressing the button with every sound they hear from the perimeter. So the patient needs to be explained that every sound may not be associated with the light, and it is the light which is to be seen and the button is to be pressed. So this is the repetition of visual fields after explaining the procedure properly to the patient, and we see that the visual field turns out to be absolutely normal. This is the case of 45-year-old female with vague complaints of ocular discomfort. She has a strong family history of glaucoma. Mother and maternal grandmother lost vision because of glaucoma. She's a hypermetrope, but the angles are open with a narrow entry. Discs are absolutely healthy. So these fields do not corroborate with the absolutely healthy disc, and they are absolutely unreliable. So the patient comes to us, we repeat the visual field, the fields are more or less okay, but I was not very comfortable with this generalized depression here. So I asked my optometrist that what he has done. He has placed the lens of -3.5 in place of +3.5. And when we correct this lens to +3.5, this generalized depression is also gone. So now this visual field corroborates with a normal disc. This is the other eye of the patient, the similar problem because the same lens was placed in the other eye also. Now, this is a patient who came to us. At the 90D, we could see there is slight disc hemorrhage, but the hemorrhage was almost all around. But the visual field defect showed a superior kind of hemifield defect here. And on fundus examination, we can find out that there is an inferior inferotemporal BRB in this patient. A case of 75-year-old lady with respiratory disease, sarcoidosis, not controlled without steroid, and the patient is on steroid, having a steroid-induced glaucoma. So what we see here is the slight worsening of visual field from April 2010 to December 2010. And such advances can only be brought out in 10-2 visual fields in advanced glaucomas or in macular program. So these are the serial visual fields from April 2010 to November 2016. And there is a program called comparison of these fields in HFA. So when we compare these visual fields, we can see there is slight worsening in these 3 points. There's slight improvement in these 2 points. And this area, which was absolutely stable for this patient. So these are actually the points at the margin of scotoma which can fluctuate. So this fluctuation was kind of disregarded as a kind of progression. Clover leaf defect occurs when the patient is fatigued, inattentive, and loses interest after initial responses. So this is how a clover leaf kind of visual field defect looks. So this is a patient who is not able to respond properly, and we can see clover leaf type of defect in this patient. So my first response in these patients is to call them at next visit, but try and do a CETA-fast in these patients. So my perimetrist did something wrong. He just repeated CETA-fast immediately after this test, which was even worse than this. So if the patient is inattentive, you can't get a visual field defect, the visual fields which are reliable by repeating at the same visit. So to avoid pitfalls, choose the correct test protocol, explain the test to the patient very properly, because we are treating the patients, not the visual fields. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for that presentation. So next we will move on to the last talk for the session for the day by Dr. Meena, Chief of Glaucoma Services, Shankara Eye Hospital, Bangalore. And she'll be talking on how to select the right tools in glaucoma investigation. Over to Dr. Meena. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, KOS, for giving me this opportunity. Let me just share my screen. So today's topic for discussion is how to select the right tool in glaucoma diagnosis. So after thorough clinical evaluation, which includes a elaborate history taking and the clinical examination, then the question comes what to choose from the glaucoma investigations armamentarium. So my talk will be divided into a new case investigation, follow-up case, and some of the newer tools which are available currently. This is a 46-year-old female patient who came for a routine checkup who had an IOP of 14 in both the eyes. When we checked her fundus, the right eye showed a 0.5 to 0.6 millimeter, 0.5 to 0.6 CDR, whereas the left eye showed a 0.8 CDR with an early inferior notching with an inferior thinning. Her pachymetry showed slightly thinner corneas of 486 micrometer, and we went ahead and did a CETA swab and a CETA standard automated perimetry. So the swab had shown a few scattered, 1 or 2 scattered spots, but it was relatively normal. When a SAP was analyzed, there was a scattered superior depressed points in the left eye, whereas the right eye was relatively normal. An RNFL analysis by OCT showed an significant inferior thinning in the left eye, which was corresponding to the clinical diagnosis as well. So, is pachymetry important? Yes. As per the OHTS and European Glaucoma Prevention Study, it was found that average CCT in ocular hypertension group was 570 micrometer, and the relative risk of POAG increased 81% for every 40 microns thinning of cornea. So it is mandatory to check the pachymetry at the first visit of any glaucoma suspect patients as well. There is evidence available that a SWAP first generation FDT have potential psychophysical tests for earlier glaucoma detection, but both SWAP and FDT, they lack defined abnormality criteria like those that exist for SAP. Yes, again, the availability of the machine is a factor. SWAP is along with the Humphrey field analyzer. This is a 63-year-old lady who came for a routine checkup and who had pseudoexfoliation in both the eyes, showed an IOP reading of 26 and 28 millimeter of mercury with an open angles. Her fundus evaluation showed a right eye 0.5 to 0.6 CDR, whereas the left eye showed a 0.8 CDR with bipolar thinning. The standard automated perimetry of right eye was relatively normal, with the left eye showed an advanced glaucomatous defect in 24-2 CETA standard. We went ahead and did a 10-2 threshold test, which is a mandatory test in advanced glaucoma to understand whether there is any macular split which is there or not. So in this patient, we can see that there is a early macular split which is seen. Again, for these advanced cases, it is important to do a macular program also to rule out the macular split. In these advanced cases, are RNFL analysis important? Yes, it can be important, but in advanced cases, the floor effect with average RNFL thickness of 50 to 60 micrometer can happen. So it may not be of great use to do these tests in advanced glaucoma. So to summarize, the glaucoma standard automated perimetry includes a central 30-2 or 24-2 with a CETA standard or a CETA fast threshold test. Selection of point pattern depends on being glaucoma suspect. We can use a CETA SWAP, 30-2 or 24-2 CETA standard. In case of established glaucoma, we can go ahead and order for a 24-2 CETA standard. In advanced cases, an additional test of 10-2 and a macular program are mandatory. When it comes to an elderly patients and patients who have other comorbidities, we can go and order 24-2 CETA fast. It is mandatory to obtain 2 to 3 baseline fields, and if the fields show an abnormality, it is important to repeat these fields. Now, as I mentioned, in advanced cases, it is important to do 10-2 tests, but even the newer, the glaucoma suspects also may reveal some central defects on 10-2, which can be missed in 24-2 programs. So trainers in the study, they have reported as much as 16% of the eyes with a normal 24-2 showed significant abnormalities in the 10-2 test. So this is one of our patients who had a very early glaucoma with a central and a paracentral scotomas in 24-2 analysis, showed a superior arcuate scotoma in the 10-2. So this is the importance of doing a 10-2 test when there is a central or a paracentral scotoma, even in an early glaucomas. We have various imaging technologies available right now, like OCT, GDX, and HRT. When the advanced imaging group studied these technologies, they found that Stratus SWT had a better diagnostic accuracy when compared to GDX and HRT. Again, the availability of machine should be a factor when we choose the right tool. Is there still a role for optic disc photography? Yes. Definitely there is a role. As we all know, advanced imaging technology does not permit the assessment of color, pallor, disc hemorrhages, the dilatation of retinal veins, etc., which is very useful in glaucoma diagnosis. So it's this photography is a very old time-tested technology when compared to the newer imaging technologies. What do we do when we follow up cases? What are the tests which we should order for? The question is, do we need to repeat a pachymetry? So this is a study done at Shankar Nethralaya which showed a carefully obtained CCT reading by a trained examiner need not be repeated for at least 3 years as long as the ocular and systemic factors known to affect the measurement of CCT are kept constant. How frequent do we do these Humphrey field analysis? So this study showed that the time required to detect a statistically significant negative MD slope decreased as the frequency of testing increased, even though it was not proportionally. So when we talk about it, for example, 80% of the eyes with an MD loss of -2 decibel per year would be detected after 3.3 years when tested once, after 2.4 years when tested twice, and after 2.1 years when tested thrice per year. But there is a downside for this, the patient's perspective of doing the Humphrey field analysis. Many patients have an aversion to do field analysis. So we have to convince the patient to get these tests and should give the confidence to the patients. In follow-up cases, it is important to understand how to detect the progression, both functionally and structurally. So functionally, when we detect the progression, the importance of glaucoma progression analysis comes into play. So this is a patient of mine who has been coming to our clinic from 2010 till date. So this was a baseline which was done in 2010 and 13, and the further analysis showed that it was stable till 2017. Now this was a 2019 and 20 showed a central scotomas, which showed as a possible progression. And in December 21, there was a significant paracentral scotomas, which showed a likely progression. So this progression analysis is even useful in cases of early glaucoma so that we can modify our treatment strategies. This is a patient, again, an RNFL analysis. This is not a glaucoma progression analysis of RNFL software. So, but this also showed a 105 RNFL defect in the earlier analysis, whereas it is thinned down when the patient came back for a follow-up after a year. So definitely RNFL analysis also can detect an early progression. What is the role of UBM and anterior segment OCT as a tool? Yes, these are the objective methods for visualizing anterior segment angle. And ASOCT does have higher sensitivity for detecting angle closure than gonioscopy. There's a recent software which is incorporated called as ITC index, which can estimate the percentage of angle closure in a given eye. And definitely sometimes we can detect many of the causes for secondary glaucomas in some of the which we may miss in standard clinical examination, like iris cysts, ancillary body cysts, which can cause secondary glaucomas. What are the newer tools which are available? Yes, there are a lot of newer parameters which we can check in OCTs, like peripapillary RNFL, macular ganglion cell, and of course the optic nerve head analysis, which includes the Bruch's membrane opening, minimum rim width, and minimum rim area. Now, what is the usage of all these things? Optic nerve head and RNFL analysis are useful in periperimetric glaucoma as well as the mild to moderate glaucoma diagnosis. When it comes to advanced glaucoma, ganglion cell analysis have been extremely useful. What is the role of OCTA? Yes, OCTA can differentiate glaucomatous from normalized. Yes, vessel density reduction on OCTA, it reaches a base level at a more advanced stage than the structural changes on OCT. So OCTA complements the visual field and OCT examination to diagnose glaucoma, detect progression, and to assess the risk of progression. Other newer modalities include pattern ERG. They have been shown reversible changes in all early glaucomas in many of the studies, and corneal hysteresis. So higher hysteresis was associated with less risk of progression, and lower hysteresis has been associated with faster retinal nerve fiber layer loss in glaucoma. To summarize, glaucoma is a disease that requires a clinical diagnosis. Clearly, advances in functional and structural evaluation techniques give us more objective documentation and precision for diagnosis and progression than the more subjective and post methods of past. So let's all apply our evidence-based medicine into the practice when it comes to the right tool to help in diagnosing the glaucoma and to help our patients. Thank you one and all for.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Meena, for that very lucid presentation on glaucoma investigations and its applicability, of course. Yeah, now I think we can go ahead with the questions. Mr. Shashank, are there any other questions from the delegates?
Ma'am, wait a minute, ma'am.
Yeah, I take this opportunity to welcome Dr. Satyan and Dr. Rajul, Dr. Sirish, Dr. Shailesh, who have been there in the meeting.
Yeah, we are there.
Thank you, sir. Shall we move on, Mr. Shashank?
Ma'am, just a second, ma'am. I'll let you know. Ma'am, actually, there are no questions.
Okay. We have one question by Dr. Swati to all our panelists here. So what is the application of macular ganglion cell complex in early diagnosis of preperimetric glaucoma? Generally, we take this GCC or the ganglion cell complex in the, logically speaking, RNFL is lost first and then the macular part is lost later. So, Dr. Sandhya, are you there? No. Dr. Satyan, sir, can you take this question?
Yeah, Shilpa, actually, I'm not sure about all other OCTs, but I'm going to talk about the spectralis and the relevance of GCL. The spectralis gives at a variability of about 1 to 2 microns. But definitely we started seeing more and more on the GCL complex, because the GCL complex in other OCTs are GCL plus IPL. But in spectralis, we can isolate the GPL alone, and then we can really look at the change, what is happening. So when you look at this, yes, there is a significant change, but we need to understand how to look for this. The superior and the inferior quadrant change in spectralis is a really fantastic tool for us to assess. In glaucoma, it is always an asymmetric representation of the GCL. So having said that, we just need to go along with the RNFL change so that we understand how much is the GCL loss at all 8 into 8 boxes are there. That if you see the spectralis. So each box gives you how much is the change from the normals. And also we can compare the other eye also, superior, inferior, and inferior, superior. All this can be definitely is very useful tool. We don't have to keep saying that we don't have to really rely only on OCT, something like that. But there is a new change, and the machines also can give you very useful information. It is not that we just have to neglect and only relying on clinical is not enough. Because each one of us look at things in a very different way. It is all very subjective. People can, we all know that the subjective variations in examination is quite high. But when you have this fundus photography and the spectralis, that significantly gives you a better understanding about the disease and early diagnosis. When you're just looking at only the fundus with your 90D, without your fundus photography, I can assure you that you are going to miss quite a lot of things. So with the fundus photography and spectralis, with the asymmetric representation of the GCL, definitely it gives you a lot of values for you to pick up the early disease. That's my comments.
Sir, that is not very specific only to the macular region, right? It just involves the arcade region also, beyond the macula as well.
No, I'm talking about the GMPL. There is a specific software only for assessing the glaucoma part of it in spectralis. That gives you only that particular data.
GCL layer thickness, like we have RNFL layer thickness.
Yes, exactly. So we can specifically assess that.
Okay. Thank you, sir. Thank you. But how does it have, whether that can be a sole entity to diagnose early glaucoma, or it has to be correlated with the...
So I told you very clearly that it needs to be correlated. It is just not in isolation, I said.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much. And Dr. Rajul sir, any experience with the dynamic contour tonometry post-refractive surgery?
No, I don't have DCT. So, whatever I will talk is only about from the literature. So the DCT is supposed to be, because it's sort of independent in relation to the Goldman explanation. It's not that DCT is absolutely independent of the corneal thickness or corneal biomechanics, because everything has to involve the cornea. So theoretically speaking, it is better. But if you look DCT, there are hardly very few people would have DCT. The cost involved is a significant factor. The other ORA also, we are talking about the ORA for last 10-15 years now. So we don't know whether exactly how much helpful it would be. But my advice would be, because lots of the refractive surgeons don't use applanation tonometer, they do only NCT. NCT has huge variability. So I think it's better to have at least a couple of Goldman reading, write down in the paper along with the corneal thickness, pre-refractive surgery corneal thickness, and hand over the paper to the patient. Of course, patient loses out, there's a different issue. But at least when the patient's in the 40s, when the chance of the glaucoma really increases, that the time, if they have that document along with the disc photograph, that would be really helpful. Eventually, if the patient loses out the paper, is not an issue, but from purely science point of view, I think if we do that much, it would be more than adequate. And I just would like to add what Satyen said. I totally agree with what Satyen said about GCC. The only thing that I use is Cirrus, and Cirrus and Spectralis, the literature says that the agreement is good. In fact, they too have a most robust data. But having said that, if you leave the literature, it is not that GCC picks up early glaucoma. There are lots of time RNFL will pick up glaucoma earlier than GCC and some other way around. So combining both and along with clinical, it cannot be replaced. So if you in fact look the World Glaucoma Association's comment about the structural function test, it says that the imaging technology is useful in experts' hand. So the indiscriminate use of the imaging would have more problem than solving the problem, because there are lots of patients have refractive error, the artifacts, the green disease, red disease. So it's going to create more problem if we say that imaging GCC is good to pick up early glaucoma. I think we should be very careful in saying that imaging is useful only after a good thorough clinical examination has been done.
I agree with you, Rajul. I'm not saying that.
No, I totally agree. I said,
just to see the
clinical
imaging and then coming to diagnosis is absolutely not indicated.
Thank you so much, sir. Dr. Meena, any inputs on these, please?
No, actually, we had done a thesis of macular GCC with comparing RNFL, but it was not of any great use in preperimetric glaucoma. So we couldn't really find too much of a use in the preperimetric glaucoma. So as Dr. Satyen pointed out, it's like, and as Dr. Rajul said, like you can use it along with the clinical diagnosis, but probably it is more useful in advance than a preperimetric.
Can I just add a few things?
Sure, sure.
When we are looking at the OCT also, there is a lot of things that we need to understand. The Spectralis in comparison to Zeiss or OptiView or other OCTs, the variability is the one thing which we need to understand. The variability of picking up the data, the thickness is about 1 to 2 microns with the Spectralis, and the next best OCT is the Zeiss and the OptiView, where it picks up, it is about 6 to 8 micron variability, and then the rest of the machines have even lesser where they're picking up. So this is essential because once you are looking at the GCL thickness, it is between 45 to 55. That is the range. Or in younger patients, it may be around somewhere around 60. So the variability of 6 to 8 microns, and it is going to be the combined GCL IPL. So we need to have looking at only the GCL thickness, and we are talking about a 20% variability. So we need to understand when we are looking at the OCT, like what Rajul was mentioning, If you can't understand what you're looking at in the OCT, then you are completely gone. In the best of the hands, then you look at understanding of the RNFL, where the damage is, and is it correlating with the GCL, then it makes a lot of sense. So we need to look at and correlate every bit of to whether you are able to pick up the disease early or not. So it is just not enough that you have only OCT and then picking up the things. So there are a lot of variabilities that we need to understand.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much. And regarding the newer perimeters, we have these head mount perimeters now. So I would like to know the panel's opinion on any experience with these newer head mount perimeters. Dr. Rajul sir, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here.
Rajul, are you using anyone? Any one of these newer ones?
I had these company people gave me the VR for a few weeks. So I used for, let's say how many, 40-45 patients. And I compared with all the patients with my Humphrey. It was a good agreement. I think ease is good. The only problem is that they don't have any progression software at this point in time.
Yes, sir.
So
Which one was that?
Elizar.
Elizar was that, sir?
So,
which one was that?
Which company? I have to check. I forgot. I think there's an Indian. They are selling in India only now.
That is Elizar.
Elizar.
So, and I compared all the patients at the regular threshold perimetry and the similar program, threshold program on the VR. The agreement was good. I didn't publish. The only problem is they don't have any progression software. We don't know when it will be available. I specifically asked the normative database, and they don't know what is the normative database. So for me, if they don't give information about the normative database, then I would be very doubtful. Of course, they have normative database, but they don't know, the Indian people don't have any access, or they don't know how much, what is the number that the normative database is based on. And in glaucoma, since it's a progressive disease, if they don't have progression software, I would not use any newer machines unless they have a robust progression software. And at this point, only 2 machines have, Humphrey and Octopus. So changing it to the newer perimeter, I would wait. Of course, there are indications like, during the talk, it was mentioned that, the patient who have they're bedridden, on wheelchair. So those patients where they doing the standard perimetry is difficult. In those patients, for the quick screening, we can use a program which is threshold faster. For that, VR is useful. Otherwise, Satyan, do you have anything?
Yeah. There's another one actually where the patient can, we can give the key. Patient can do the perimetry at home using his iPad. That is iPad-based newer software.
Melbourne.
Sorry.
Melbourne rapid test.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
But that is screening, no?
Yeah, that is no. They have now. So it has come online, so they can use it at home. Because I think that gives a lot of comfort for the patient as such. But of course, as you are saying that it has its own restrictions, I'm not sure still about the progression analysis in that also. So, but they just have to pay. The patient have to just pay, and then they can just download it in their iPad, and then they can do it. It is quite easy to do, because the patient don't have to come here and then sit here, wait for a long time. That can be done. That's a newer trend now. That will be probably soon available next month, I think.
Okay.
Thank you, sir. Anybody else has any questions to ask, or shall we conclude the session for the day?
Thank you so much, Shilpa and Dr. Ilan Kumaran and the entire team behind this KOS meeting, and we wish you all the best for the today and tomorrow's events. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Shilpa.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Shilpa.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. Mr. Shashank, let's conclude.
Yeah, sure, ma'am.